Under the golden haze of a Beverly Hills sunset, Ethan Blackstone stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching the world below blur into quiet insignificance. From this height, the city's pulse was barely a whisper. Just flickers of light, distant sirens, the occasional shadow moving across a rooftop. For a man like Ethan, whose empire stretched across continents and whose face adorned financial magazines, silence wasn't a relief. It was a sentence. He hadn't always been this way. Years ago, ambition had given him purpose. He'd built Blackstone Technologies from nothing but an idea scribbled on a napkin in a college dorm room. Now he owned everything he once dreamed of, but the more he accumulated, the more he realized that wealth could fill a home, not a life. His 2 marriages, one brief and passionate, the other long and cold, had ended in disappointment. He had become, in his own words, a man defined by what he built, not by who he became. What haunted Ethan most wasn't the echo of betrayal, but the absence of something deeper. Not love. He no longer trusted that word, but something quieter, more permanent, legacy. He wanted a child, not out of romance, but necessity. A child to him was continuity, a reason to believe he existed beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. Ethan had explored traditional surrogacy, private adoption, even international options. Each came with complications, legal entanglements, and emotional risks. He didn't want attachments. He didn't want someone entangled in his life or challenging his control. He needed something different, uncomplicated, direct. It was during one of his late-night walks through Venice Beach that he found what he wasn't looking for. The coastal strip was quiet, colored in soft neon and scattered palm silhouettes. He often wandered here when sleep evaded him. Tonight, the air tasted of salt and asphalt. He walked past closed cafes and shuttered storefronts until a motion on the sidewalk caught his eye. A young woman sat cross-legged against a brick wall, sketching furiously into a torn sheet of newspaper. Her fingers were blackened with charcoal, her coat several sizes too big, and her hair unkempt in a way that hinted at months without luxury. Yet something about her posture, her concentration, the stillness with which she created. It stopped. He paused. She didn't look up. "What are you drawing?" he asked, his voice more curious than compassionate. Her hand didn't stop moving. "A question," she said simply. Ethan tilted his head. "You draw questions?" "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes answers, but mostly just what I feel." That struck him, not because it was profound, but because it was real. He looked at her face more closely now. She was young, maybe 30, 31. Her eyes, though tired, held a steel-gray depth, and her accent hinted at somewhere further north. "Quebec?" "Maybe. What's your name?" he asked. She finally met his gaze. "Camille. Camille Dufour." He hesitated. "French?" "French-Canadian." "And you're homeless?" She didn't flinch. "Depends on how you define home." He admired her lack of defensiveness. No pity, no dramatics, just facts. She returned to her drawing. He should have walked away. Instead, he sat beside her, a safe distance apart. "What if I had a proposal?" "For you?" She chuckled, dry and tired. "You're not the first rich man to start a sentence that way." "It's not what you think." Camille finally turned toward him again, this time curious. "Then say it." Ethan looked at the ground, searching for the least offensive way to say something inherently unorthodox. "I'm looking for someone to carry my child. Artificial. Insemination. No relationship, no physical expectations. I cover all medical and living expenses. You get a safe place, complete health care, and a substantial compensation." She said nothing at first. "I'm serious," he added. "Do I look like someone who thinks you're joking?" "No," he admitted. She set down her pencil. "Why me?" "Because you're not afraid of silence," he said. "Because I saw you creating something from nothing. Because you looked like someone who's lost things, but not herself." Camille blinked. "That's either the strangest compliment I've ever received or the most manipulative," she said. I don't manipulate. He replied evenly. I offer. Camille leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. The wind rustled her coat, revealing a faded hoodie beneath it. She looked like someone who once had dreams she hadn't yet buried. How do I know you won't? Control me? She asked. Because I don't want control, Ethan said. I want a legacy, that's it. No romantic fantasy? No secret need to play savior? None. Silence fell again. A minute passed, then 2. Finally, Camille reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. She flipped through several pages, tore one out, and handed it to him. It was a sketch. A mother holding a child, her features undefined but her hands strong. I don't agree yet, she said. But if I did, this is what I'd be fighting for. He stared at the drawing. It was haunting, raw. He folded it carefully. Let me make arrangements. You can stay in a guest house I own in Malibu. Private, safe. We'll draft a contract with whatever clauses you need. Camille stood, dusting herself off. And what if I change my mind? Then you walk away, no penalties. She studied him for another long moment. Her eyes softened, then hardened again. If I say yes, it's because I'm choosing to. Not because I'm desperate. Ethan nodded. Understood. She picked up her worn backpack and sketch pad. Give me 2 days. Then she walked away. Ethan watched her disappear into the shadows of Venice Beach, not realizing that the decision she was about to make would shatter every barrier he had built to keep the world out. And so it began, not with a kiss, not with fireworks, but with a question drawn in charcoal and a silence that, for the first time in years, didn't feel empty. Camille arrived at the Malibu beach house just as the sky surrendered to dusk. The ocean beyond stretched endlessly, kissed by pink and indigo streaks, the waves rhythmically brushing the shore like a lullaby from a place she'd once forgotten how to reach. For the first time in years, the air around her didn't smell like exhaust or concrete. It smelled clean, open, like possibility. The house itself was modest by Ethan Blackstone's standards, 2 stories. All glass and wood, built into the hillside with a quiet grace, but to Camille, it felt like another world. She stood still in the entryway for several minutes, her hands wrapped around the straps of her old canvas backpack. The silence here was different, not the threatening kind that she'd grown used to sleeping through on sidewalks and bus stops, but the kind that held space. She walked through the rooms slowly. Sunlight poured through the high windows, casting shadows on polished floors. The furniture was neutral, intentional, almost too pristine, but someone had placed a small vase of daisies on the windowsill. Camille couldn't tell if it was for comfort or decoration. Either way, she noticed, Rebecca, the live-in nurse Ethan had arranged, was kind in the way nurses always are when they've seen more suffering than they care to admit. She gave Camille a quick tour, showed her the pantry full of food she hadn't dared dream of touching, the linen closet with more towels than a family of 5 would need, and the private room with medical supplies and books on prenatal health stacked neatly on a shelf. Camille thanked her softly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. She wasn't used to being the center of care. The first night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the king-sized bed, listening to the lull of the ocean, trying to believe that she was truly here, that no one was going to kick her out in the morning, that the sheets she curled herself into wouldn't be taken away at dawn. Her fingers rested on her lower stomach, barely curved but already beginning to feel different. Somewhere inside her something had started, something real, something irrevocable. The following days unfolded with a strange kind of rhythm, quiet breakfasts on the patio with avocado toast and herbal tea, daily check-ins with Rebecca, long walks by the shore when she felt strong enough. And when she didn't, she stayed inside and painted. Ethan, true to his word, stayed distant. At first, he would check in via text every few days, short messages, polite questions, clinical tone. But his presence lingered. Sometimes Camille would look at the minimalist art on the wall and wonder what kind of man had chosen these shapes, these empty frames, this curated calm. She imagined him moving through his world like a shadow, polished, guarded, always just out of reach. One morning, a box appeared on the doorstep. No note. Inside were oil paints, high-grade brushes, and several stretched canvases. Camille sat cross-legged on the floor and stared at the colors for a long time before she touched them. When she did, her hands didn't tremble. They remembered. She painted late into the night, soft tones and sharp contrasts bleeding together on canvas as if her soul had been waiting for permission to breathe. The painting she finished first was of a single golden leaf falling through an abstract sky. She titled it Inheritance. Ethan came by unannounced a week later. He brought fresh pears and a stack of books on child psychology. He didn't step inside until she invited him. They sat across from each other on the patio, the ocean murmuring between them, their conversation, hesitant but unforced. She asked him why he'd chosen her, truly. He didn't offer a rehearsed answer. "Because when I saw you, I realized you didn't need saving," he said. "And I didn't want to be saved either. I just wanted to make something real." Camille absorbed that. It didn't sound like manipulation. It sounded like confession. Over the next few weeks, his visits became more frequent. Sometimes he brought smoothies, other times a strange fact he'd read in a parenting book. Once he brought her a scarf he said reminded him of the way her hair moved in the wind. She laughed for the first time in his presence, a sound so spontaneous and warm that it startled even her. Despite their careful boundaries, the space between them began to shift. Not with grand gestures, but with quiet recognitions. She started saving a second cup of tea in the morning, just in case he dropped by. He began staying a little longer each time. One Saturday, Rebecca invited Camille to attend a small art therapy workshop she volunteered at in Santa Monica. The session focused on recovery through expression, particularly for women who had experienced homelessness or trauma. Camille hesitated, unsure if she belonged anywhere anymore, unsure of where she fit between her past and this strange present, but eventually she agreed. Ethan came with her, not as her escort but as her quiet witness. Inside the community center, surrounded by chip tables and mismatched chairs, Camille felt more grounded than she had in months. She picked up a brush and painted with women who had also known hunger, loss, nights spent praying for morning. They didn't ask questions. They simply created beside her. At the end of the session, each woman was invited to share what she had made. Camille stood slowly and held up her painting, a faceless figure standing in the rain, holding a flickering candle. "I used to think survival was enough," she said. "But now I think survival is just the beginning. The real work is learning how to become someone again, not for anyone else, but for myself." There was quiet applause. Ethan didn't clap. He just looked at her, the kind of look people give when they realize something sacred is happening. Back home, she found a letter on her nightstand. From him, it read, "You remind me that stillness isn't emptiness. I don't know what this is becoming, Camille, but I do know I've never wanted to understand someone more than I want to understand you." She folded it carefully and placed it inside her journal. In the mirror, her belly had begun to swell. She touched it with both hands, not with fear anymore, but with reverence. Something was growing. Yes, inside her. But more than that, something was beginning between them. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the very first traces of it. The waiting room was colder than Camille expected, not in temperature, but in tone. A sterile quiet broken only by the hum of soft music and the occasional click of a nurse's shoes on the polished floor. Ethan sat beside her, one leg crossed over the other, his posture unnervingly composed. Yet Camille could sense something underneath it, some flicker of unrest that hadn't existed in him weeks ago. Maybe it was in the way he glanced at the clock every 30 seconds, or how he kept rubbing his thumb along the seam of his blazer, like he needed something to hold on to. She was 14 weeks along. Today was the ultrasound. Camille wasn't sure how to feel. She had tried to imagine the moment, the screen, the sound, the faint outline of something unexplainable becoming real. but no amount of mental rehearsal could prepare her for what would happen when that line between theory and life was finally crossed. The technician called her name. Ethan stood quickly, perhaps too quickly, and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then took it, surprised by the steadiness of his grip. The room they entered was softly lit, with sea-blue walls and gentle lighting that tried to disguise its clinical nature. Camille lay back on the exam table, lifting her shirt to reveal the small curve of her abdomen. Ethan stood nearby, not too close, but closer than he might have dared a month ago. He didn't look away. He didn't pretend this was just another business checkpoint. He watched like a man who, for the first time, had something to lose. The technician applied the gel and pressed the transducer to her stomach. A few silent moments passed, then a sound filled the room, faint, fast, unmistakable. Heartbeat, Camille gasped. Her hands instinctively flew to her mouth and tears began to pool in her eyes. The sound wasn't like anything she'd ever heard before. Less like a beat, more like the fluttering of wings. Fragile, yet undeniable. A living rhythm that hadn't existed before now. That existed because of her. Ethan didn't speak. His entire body had gone still. The technician smiled. "That's your baby," she said softly. Strong heartbeat. Camille looked toward Ethan. His eyes were locked on the screen, but something about him had changed. His jaw was slack and his breathing uneven. He looked stunned, as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. But then the technician frowned slightly, adjusting the angle. Her smile widened. "Actually," she said, "there's another." "Another." Camille blinked. "What?" "2 heartbeats." The technician confirmed. "You're having twins." Ethan sat down abruptly in the nearby chair. Camille turned her head toward him, laughing through her tears. "Twins?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "Is this some kind of cosmic joke?" Didn't answer, not immediately. But when he finally looked at her, something shimmered in his eyes. Not fear, not calculation, wonder. Later in the car, the silence between them was heavier than usual, but not uncomfortable. Camille cradled the ultrasound images in her lap, her thumb brushing across the blurred outlines of the 2 tiny figures curled inside her. She kept glancing at them like they might vanish if she looked away too long. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely in his lap. He hadn't spoken since they left the clinic, but Camille could see his mind working, could almost hear it spinning behind his composed expression. "You're quiet," she said, breaking the silence. "I'm recalibrating," he replied. She laughed softly. "Figures." He finally looked at her. "Do you realize what this means?" She raised an eyebrow. "I'll be the size of a house in a few months?" He didn't smile. "Not really. It means everything changes." Camille nodded, her voice gentler. "It already has." That evening he brought a stack of books to the beach house, everything from twin development to parenting guides. He didn't stay long, just handed them over and stood awkwardly at the door. "I thought you might want to get ahead of it," he said. She smiled. "I already am." Before he left, he paused. "I didn't expect to feel anything when I heard those heartbeats," he admitted. "But I did. Me too." The door closed softly behind him. Over the next few weeks, something began to shift. Ethan's visits became more frequent, more casual. Sometimes he stayed for tea. Other times he simply stood on the balcony, listening to the ocean beside her. The silence between them filled with something warmer now, less guarded. They spoke about names. Camille favored softer, more poetic choices. Ethan leaned toward classic, historical ones. They disagreed, debated, even argued with affection neither one would admit aloud. One morning, Camille painted 2 small birds perched on a single branch. She titled the piece Shared Beginning and hung it in the nursery. Ethan saw it on his next visit and stood staring at it longer than he did most things. "That's them?" he asked. She nodded. "They look like they belong to each other." "They do." He said nothing for a while, then quietly, "I hope they don't grow up feeling like shadows of someone's plan." Camille turned to him. Then let's not treat them like that. He met her gaze, something raw and unsure flickering behind his composed mask. I don't know how to be that kind of man. You don't have to know yet, she said. You just have to want to learn. And for the first time, he didn't. Look away. The next day, they attended a volunteer event at a pediatric hospital. Camille's idea. She thought it might help them connect beyond the walls of Malibu and medical appointments. Ethan hesitated at first, but followed. Watching the children laugh and play, listening to the stories of resilience from parents who had nothing but hope to hold on to, Ethan softened in ways he hadn't anticipated. That evening, he confessed, something as they walked back to the car. I thought a child would be an extension of me, an heir, a legacy, but maybe there'll be something better, a beginning I never gave myself permission to have. Camille took his hand, no longer afraid of how natural it felt. Then let's start there. They stood together under the dimming sky, the faint echoes of laughter from the hospital still trailing behind them. In that moment, the future felt less like an arrangement and more like a promise, not yet spoken, but undeniably alive. It had become routine, not in the way patterns of dullness settle over ordinary life, but in the quiet comfort of repetition, familiar glances, daily rituals, the cadence of two people adjusting to something neither of them dared name. Camille had begun to notice the little things, the way Ethan brought her herbal tea without asking which kind, the way he lingered by the nursery door after helping her unpack baby clothes, the way his presence no longer felt like an intrusion, but an unspoken form of companionship. Each morning began with stillness. The ocean stretched endlessly from the balcony, and the air was filled with possibility and a kind of emotional stillness that Camille had never known before. Ethan arrived most days before noon, often carrying something small, a book, a recommendation from his sister Harper, or a new playlist of classical music that had calmed him during a stressful week. She began to anticipate his visits not with apprehension, but with something dangerously close to longing. Their conversations became layered. Camille had always been a storyteller, but now she shared more than her past. She shared pieces of her dreams. She talked about wanting to teach again, about maybe writing a book someday. Ethan listened, really listened, as if her voice wasn't just sound but a map leading somewhere important. In turn, he spoke of his childhood more openly, the isolation of growing up in a house where achievement was currency and love was conditional. He told her about the treehouse he built himself at 13, because he couldn't stand the walls inside his parents' mansion. You know, he said one afternoon, their feet buried in warm sand, I used to think love was a liability, loophole in logic, but lately… He stopped, staring into the tide. Camille didn't press. She only reached out and let her hand brush his, not holding, not yet. Just there. It wasn't love, not exactly, but it was the gravity that precedes it. The quiet pull of two people who had built their lives trying not to need anyone, only to find that need could be a form of truth. Still, not all things beautiful are free from doubt. One evening, Camille stood alone in the nursery, her hands smoothing the edges of a tiny onesie, her reflection caught in the window glass. The twins were growing strong inside her, and so was something else, an ache she hadn't expected. She wasn't afraid of birth. She wasn't even afraid of motherhood. She was afraid of being forgotten, because no matter how tender Ethan had become, no matter how many moments they shared that whispered of more, the contract still existed. It loomed like a shadow in the corners of her joy. It reminded her that in 3 short months after the twins were born, she was supposed to disappear. The thought haunted her. She began waking in the middle of the night, her heart racing, her mind spiraling into possibilities she didn't want to imagine. What if Ethan changed his mind? What if he took the children? What if she was just a means to an end, despite everything he said and did? Camille tried to hide it. She kept smiling, kept painting, kept playing the part of someone who had accepted the terms of this arrangement with peace. But her paintings began to darken. Her strokes became sharper. The softness in her palate turned stormy. She didn't know how to explain it to Ethan, so she said nothing, until one day she fainted. It happened during a morning walk along the cliffs. One moment she was breathing in the salt-heavy wind, and the next the world tilted and fell away. When she woke in the hospital, Ethan was at her side. His face was pale, his hands gripped tightly around hers. He didn't speak right away, just looked at her like he was afraid that saying something would break the fragile miracle of her being awake. "You scared me," he said finally, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it. "I'm okay," she whispered, but her voice wavered. "The babies, they're fine. The doctor said it was dehydration. But Camille, you didn't tell me you weren't sleeping." She looked away. "I didn't want you to worry." "I'm already worried," he said. "Every day." Something in his voice cracked. Camille turned her eyes back to him and saw something she hadn't dared hope for. Fear. Not the kind born from obligation, but the kind born from care. He didn't leave her side for the next 2 days, not once. He brought her food, played music. She liked, even read to her when she couldn't focus. It was during those moments when the walls fell completely that Camille allowed herself to believe that perhaps this was becoming something different. When they returned to the beach house, Ethan stood in the nursery doorway again, watching the sunlight fall on the pale blue walls. Camille entered behind him, rested her hand lightly on his back. "I was afraid you'd see me differently after this," she said. "I do," he replied, "but not the way you think. I see you more clearly." She turned him to face her. "And what do you see?" He searched her face, his expression unreadable for a moment and then softened. "I see someone who matters. Not because you're carrying my children, but because you've become the person I look for without realizing it." Camille's throat tightened. She didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. Instead, she led him into the nursery, sat with him on the floor, and showed him a new painting, one he hadn't seen yet. It was of 2 children walking through a golden forest, their hands clasped tightly, their faces turned toward the light. He stared at it, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he whispered, "What's it called?" She looked at him. Belonging. That night she dreamed not of departure but of arrival, of staying, of building something not out of contracts, but of moments. And Ethan, though still carrying the weight of caution, lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, repeating her word over and over in his mind. Belonging. It no longer felt foreign. The night Camille went into labor, the sky above Malibu was ink dark and starless. The wind rolled in off the ocean in steady, pulsing waves, mirroring the rhythm of something ancient awakening inside her. She had woken at 3 a.m., breath caught in her throat, the sheets twisted around her legs, her body unmistakably telling her it was time. She didn't scream, she didn't panic. She simply sat up, placed both hands over her swollen belly, and whispered, "We're ready." Within minutes, Ethan was at the door. His hair was tousled, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, but his expression was steady. He had been preparing for this moment in every way he knew how, reading, planning, controlling. But nothing could have prepared him for the fear that struck him silent when he saw her gripping the edge of the kitchen table, breathing through. Another contraction. Camille managed a faint smile. "I guess your schedule just got interrupted." He didn't smile back. He crossed the room, took her hand, and simply said, "I've got you." At the hospital, time shifted. The sterile white lights blurred at the edges, the sounds muffled beneath the heaviness of what was unfolding. Camille was strong, her strength both terrifying and awe-inspiring. She labored with a quiet tenacity, her body trembling but her spirit unwavering. Ethan stayed beside her, one hand clasping hers, the other brushing damp strands of hair from her forehead. He whispered affirmations he didn't even know he believed until he said them out loud. When the first cry came, sharp, loud, full of life, Camille broke into tears. Jasper was born just before dawn, his tiny fists clenched, his chest rising, and falling with furious intent. 3 minutes later, Elias arrived, quieter but alert, his wide eyes blinking as though trying to memorize the moment he entered the world. Camille held them both, her arms forming a circle around the two beings. She had grown from within. Ethan didn't speak, didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. He simply watched, his heart catching on a sensation he hadn't felt in years, something that tasted like reverence. When Camille looked up at him, her voice was hoarse. "We did it." He knelt beside her bed and whispered, "No, you did this. You brought them here." The room was thick with something sacred, and yet, even as the first light of morning spilled through the blinds, painting golden lines across the hospital floor, a shadow crept in. She arrived unannounced. Veronica Hale, Ethan's ex-fiancée, whose elegance was as calculated as her timing. She entered the room with a bouquet too large and a smile too polished. Camille, exhausted and glowing from childbirth, froze when she saw the woman standing in the doorway, her gaze sweeping across the newborns as though assessing them like assets. "I heard the news," Veronica said, stepping closer. "Twins, that's impressive, even for you, Ethan." Camille shifted instinctively, holding the babies closer. Ethan stepped forward, trying to intercept the moment. "This isn't the time, Veronica." But the damage was done. Veronica turned to Camille and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Camille. I've heard very little, but enough." Camille didn't respond. Her silence was deliberate, powerful. Veronica continued, "Ethan always did move quickly when it came to what he wanted. I just never thought this would be the route he'd take. But I suppose everyone evolves." She looked once more at the children, then back at Ethan. "Call me when you're back. To yourself." She left without waiting for a reply. The door clicked shut, but her presence lingered like perfume too heavy for the room. Camille turned her face away from Ethan, her jaw clenched. The fragile cocoon of intimacy they had spun over the past months had been punctured, not by betrayal, but by reminder. Reminder of what this began as. Reminder of how easily it could all be reduced. Ethan stood helpless, words faltering on his tongue. "Camille." But she didn't want apologies, she wanted clarity. "Is that what I am to her?" she asked, voice calm. "An arrangement, an inconvenience?" "She doesn't know anything." "But does she need to?" Ethan moved closer. "You're not just this to me, Camille. You never were." Camille looked down at her sons. "I want to believe that. I do. But sometimes I still feel like a placeholder for a role you designed. A womb with a name." He sat beside her, his hands trembling for the first time. "You're the mother of my children, and you've become the only person who sees me beyond all of this." She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I need space. Just a few days, not to run away, just to remember who I am without you standing in the room." He wanted to fight it, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded. Camille left the hospital with the twins and retreated to a quiet retreat center in Ojai, one that Rebecca had mentioned during a prenatal appointment. The nurses there knew how to care without judgment, how to let new mothers breathe, cry, rest, and rediscover themselves. She took long walks beneath oak trees. She rocked the babies under the stars. She journaled. And for the first time since agreeing to the contract, she allowed herself to grieve. Not for what she had lost, but for the life she had almost convinced herself she didn't deserve. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the Malibu house and found it unbearably empty. He wandered the halls at night, lingering in the nursery she had filled with color, music, and dreams. Without her, the house was not just silent, it was lifeless. Harper arrived one morning, uninvited as always, with coffee in hand and fire in her voice. "She's not asking you to give up control," she said, leaning against the kitchen island. "She's asking you to choose something more than logic." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "And what if I don't know how?" "Then figure it out. Because love isn't something you schedule. It's something you surrender to." That night, he drove to Ojai. He didn't bring flowers, he didn't rehearse a speech. He simply showed up, heart pounding, hands empty except for the one truth he had refused to say aloud for too long. Camille stood on the porch, one twin in her arms, the other asleep behind her. When she saw him, she didn't smile. But she didn't close the door either. He stepped forward and said, "I tore up the contract. I don't care how this started. I only care how it continues. With you. With them. With love." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, her eyes full of all the pain, all the hope, and all the strength she had carried since the beginning. Then finally she whispered, "Don't say it if you don't mean it. I've never meant anything more." And there, beneath a quiet sky and two sleeping suns, Camille let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an ending, but the beginning of everything. The house no longer echoed. It breathed. It pulsed with the rhythm of small feet, soft laughter, lullabies hummed under breath, and the warm chaos of a family learning itself for the first time. Where there had once been minimalist furniture and cold silence, there were now toys tucked under tables, baby socks in corners, and sunlight that seemed warmer, as though the house itself had exhaled. Camille moved through the rooms with ease now, not like a guest or a resident fulfilling a contract, but like someone who had helped build the home from the inside out. Ethan had changed too. The man who once lived by systems, calculations, and sterile efficiency had begun to loosen in quiet ways. His schedule now accommodated bedtime routines. His suits were often traded for cotton shirts stained with applesauce or formula. He no longer measured value by productivity or legacy, but by proximity. How close he was to the sound of his son's breathing, to the feeling of Camille's hand reaching for his during dinner. They married quietly. No press, no performance. Just them, standing barefoot on the sand behind the Malibu house, the Pacific a silent witness to the vows spoken without pretense. Camille wore a linen dress she'd altered herself. Ethan wore a shirt Harper had chosen, soft gray rolled at the sleeves. Jasper and Elias were cradled in the arms of Rebecca and Harper, dressed in cream, curious about the sea foam and the wind. Their vows were not declarations of forever. They were small, honest things, promises made not in grandeur but in recognition. "I promise to meet you where you are," Camille had said, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his. "And I promise to choose this," Ethan replied, "even when it's difficult to understand what this is." There were no rings, just a shared breath and the slow dance of two people letting go of who they used to be. In the months that followed, their love deepened not in dramatic confessions, but in repetition, in the ordinary, the domestic, the deeply human. Camille opened an art and healing center in Echo Park, partnering with women who had survived homelessness or crisis. It was called the Becoming Project. The walls were filled with canvases painted by those who thought they had nothing left to say, and every piece told a story of return, of finding one's voice after forgetting what it sounded like. Ethan funded the project silently, never asking for credit. He didn't need to. His fulfillment came in the mornings he spent assembling puzzles with his sons on the nursery rug, or in the evenings when Camille would curl against him with a book in hand, her head resting on his chest as if it had always belonged there. Their love was not effortless. There were still hard days, days when Camille would fall into silence, caught in memories of nights she'd slept on concrete. Days when Ethan would tense at news from the financial world, as if his old identity still waited just beyond the door, ready to reclaim him. But those moments no longer frightened them. They honored them, sat beside them, loved each other through them. Jasper was bold, always reaching for things, always determined. Elias was watchful, gentle, content to observe before moving. They were different in every way, and yet when they laughed together, it was like hearing two halves of the same melody. One night, after a particularly long day, Camille stood in the nursery doorway and watched Ethan asleep on the floor, a child on each arm. The boys had curled into his sides, their bodies rising and falling with his breath. Camille didn't speak. She only watched, her heart so full it ached. She walked quietly to the desk and pulled open a drawer. Inside, folded neatly beneath a stack of baby photographs, was the contract. She unfolded it and read through it again, not as a reminder of how things began, but as a way to measure how far they had come. The language was clinical, distant, Terms like gestational period, compensation, and custodial rights stared back at her like the shell of a life she no longer recognized. She had signed it thinking she was trading her body for survival. She hadn't known she would find herself in the process. She held a match over it for a moment, tempted. But then she folded it again, slower this time, and tucked it back into the drawer. Not to preserve the agreement, but to remind herself that transformation is never born from a perfect beginning. It is born in the breaking, in the uncertainty, in the choice to stay. Camille began recording letters to the boys, video journals she titled, "For When You Ask." In them, she spoke honestly about who she had been, about how she met their father, about the things she hadn't understood about love until she was forced to give it without assurance. She spoke not of fairy tales, but of real choices, of healing, forgiveness. Ethan listened to each one in secret, heart swelling with each truth she laid bare. On their first wedding anniversary, Ethan gave her a single item, a sketchbook. Inside, the first page bore a message in his handwriting. "I used to think permanence was something you signed for, but now I know. It's something you build moment by moment, with your hands and your heart. This is yours. Fill it." She cried when she read it, not because it was romantic, but because it was true. That night they danced in the living room after the boys were asleep, barefoot on the rug, the record player humming an old jazz tune. Camille laughed when Ethan stumbled over the beat, and he whispered that he'd never had rhythm until her. They moved like people who had weathered something impossible and come out the other side not untouched, but better for having been undone. The house by the sea remained the same in structure, but everything else had changed. Its walls had absorbed lullabies and arguments, joy and fear, and above all, the kind of love that does not need to be explained to be real. There would always be questions from the outside about how they began, about what it all meant, but inside those walls they knew the answer. It had never been about the contract. It had always been about the heart. Ethan Blackstone and Camille Dufour's journey began as a transaction, calculated, emotionless, signed with ink and outlined in legal terms. He was a billionaire searching for a legacy, unwilling to risk love again. She was a homeless artist trying to survive, never expecting a second chance at belonging. What started as a cold agreement evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. Through the months of shared silences, slow trust, vulnerability, and ultimately the miracle of life, they found themselves transformed, not just by the birth of their twin sons, but by the rediscovery of humanity, compassion, and love. Together they didn't just build a family, they redefined what it means to begin again. The story of Ethan and Camille teaches us that healing and love rarely come wrapped in perfection. Often they grow in the mess, between broken expectations, reluctant confessions, and the quiet moments when two people choose to stay, even when walking away would be easier. Life will always offer contracts, conditions, and logical paths. But the most meaningful transformations happen when we open ourselves to the unpredictable, when we dare to build something real beyond the blueprint. Apply this to your own life. Ask yourself, where have you closed off possibility out of fear or control? What would happen if you let go just a little and allowed something deeper to take root? Legacy isn't just what we leave behind. It's how we love while we're here. Quick question for you. What do you think was the true turning point of Ethan and Camille's story? A. When the twins were born. B. When Ethan tore up the contract and asked her to stay. Comment below with your answer, A or B. And what about you? What part of this story spoke to you most deeply? Leave your thoughts in the comments so others in our community can connect and reflect with you. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you hope, don't forget to subscribe to Fortune's Wrath and support the channel. Your support helps us bring you more stories that touch the soul. See you in the next one.